You are what you do, not what you say you'll do. Carl Jung. Have you ever felt like the way your mind works just doesn't match the rhythm of the world around you? Like you're constantly adjusting, being told to be more practical, stop overthinking, or tone it down. In a world obsessed with conformity and quick fixes, it's easy to wonder, is there something wrong with me? But what if the problem isn't you? What if the reason you've always felt a little out of sync is because you've never truly understood how your mind was designed to work? Carl Jung believed that each of us sees life through a distinct psychological lens, not a flaw, a pattern, a blueprint. And when you discover yours, everything begins to make sense, from the way you think and connect, to the decisions you make, the careers you choose, and the conflicts you keep repeating. Jung identified 4 core types of personality, one shaping how we process the world around us. The thinker. Logical, structured, driven by clarity and analysis. The feeler. Empathetic, value-driven, attuned to emotion and meaning. The sensor. Grounded, practical, focused on the present moment. The intuitive, visionary, imaginative, drawn to patterns and possibilities. These aren't just traits, they're maps. And the more you understand the map of your mind, the less time you spend lost inside it. So before you judge yourself for being too much or not enough, ask this: what if the world just isn't speaking your psychological language? Think about it, not just for a second, but deeply. Since childhood, your mind has been shaped by forces you couldn't even see. Parents praised some traits and corrected others. Teachers told you what was smart, mature, or appropriate. Society handed you silent rules about how to behave, how to think, and how to feel. If you were analytical, you might have been told you were cold. If you were emotional, they said you were too sensitive. If you were imaginative, they called you unrealistic. If you were detail-oriented, you were labeled rigid or boring. Over time, those voices didn't just influence you, they layered themselves over your identity. And the more they tried to define who you should be, the further you drifted from who you are. So let me ask you this. Have you ever paused to question whether the way you see the world is truly your own? Or are you still navigating life through a lens someone else handed you? Carl Jung believed that most people never recognize the filter through which they experience reality. They go through life assuming their perspective is neutral, when in truth, it's deeply shaped by their dominant psychological type. And here's the real cost. When you don't understand your own mind, you start chasing goals, careers, even relationships that were never meant for you. I once knew someone just like that. A brilliant, emotionally attuned friend of mine spent years in corporate finance because she loved it, but because it seemed like the smart choice. She was successful on the outside but felt constantly out of alignment inside. It wasn't until she discovered Jung's theory of personality types that it all clicked. She wasn't broken. She was just living in a world that didn't match the way her mind was wired. She was a feeler, trying to survive in a thinker's world. And that's the turning point. Discovering your dominant function isn't about putting a label on yourself. It's about reclaiming your inner compass. When you understand how your mind naturally operates, you stop forcing yourself into molds that were never meant for you. You begin to build a life that feels aligned, intentional, and real. But here's what most people miss. Your dominant function is only part of the story. Beneath the surface lies your inferior function, the side of you that feels unfamiliar, awkward, or even threatening. And yet, according to Jung, this neglected part of your psyche holds the key to your deepest personal growth. So ask yourself, what part of you have you silenced just to fit in? What qualities have you buried because the world didn't approve? And what if those very traits are the missing pieces of your wholeness? Because becoming yourself isn't just about discovering who you are. It's about welcoming back all the parts you were taught to hide. So let's go deeper. Before you can fully understand which type you are, there's a foundational layer Jung believed we must recognize first, one that shapes where your energy naturally flows. He called it the attitude of the psyche, introversion and extroversion. Now, most people throw around those words like personality stereotypes. I'm such an introvert, or she's a total extrovert, as if they describe how social you are. But Jung's definition had nothing to do with being quiet or outgoing. It's not about how loud your voice is. It's about where your consciousness is directed. Introversion is inwardly focused. If you're introverted, you gain energy through reflection, solitude, and internal clarity. You process thoughts before speaking, and often feel most alive in quiet, meaningful spaces. Extroversion, on the other hand, is outwardly focused. If you're extroverted, you come alive through interaction, external stimulation, and real-world engagement. You think best while moving, doing, and talking things out loud. Let me give you an example. I once worked with a woman named Emma. At work, she led teams, gave presentations, and thrived in collaborative environments. On the surface, she looked like a classic extrovert, confident, expressive, magnetic. But after work, she was exhausted, not just tired, drained. She needed hours alone just to feel like herself again. It turned out Emma wasn't an extrovert at all. She was an introvert playing an extrovert's role. And the burnout wasn't about work, it was about working against her natural orientation. That's what Jung emphasized. Neither introversion nor extroversion is better. They're simply two different orientations of consciousness, two distinct ways of gathering energy and making sense of the world. But when you live against your type, when you force your mind to operate in a mode it wasn't designed for, you begin to lose touch with your vitality. So let me ask you this. When you're overwhelmed or depleted, what helps you reset quiet time alone or connection with others? And when you're processing something important, do you go inward to reflector? Do you seek clarity by talking it through? These aren't minor preferences. They're key indicators of how your psyche naturally operates. And here's where things get even more interesting. Your orientation, introverted or extroverted, acts as the gateway to how you use the 4 core psychological functions Jung identified: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. Think of it like this. Your attitude, introversion or extroversion, tells us where your energy flows. But your dominant function tells us how your mind processes that energy. Are you guided more by logic or emotion? Are you focused on concrete reality or abstract possibilities? Do you make decisions based on values or facts? Do you trust what's in front of you or what's beneath the surface? Each of us leads with one dominant function, supported by secondary ones, while others remain underdeveloped or buried deep in the unconscious. And once you uncover your function, stack your internal hierarchy of mental habits, you begin to understand why certain roles come naturally to you and why others feel like swimming against the current. But here's the trap. Most people only know their dominant function. That's the one the world praises, rewards, and reinforces. It's the comfortable zone. But what about the part of you that's been quiet? The function that's been ignored, repressed, or judged? Jung believed that real growth doesn't come from doubling down on what you already do well. It comes from integrating the parts of you that have gone unheard. And yes, it's uncomfortable. At first, it may feel wrong, but it's not wrong. It's just unfamiliar. That unfamiliar space, that's the doorway to individuation. That's where transformation begins. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But here's the paradox. Most people never even get close because they don't understand how their mind actually works. They try to become better versions of themselves, not realizing they're building on the wrong foundation. At the core of Jung's personality theory are 4 psychological functions, 4 ways of perceiving the world and making decisions. And they're more than just traits. They're fundamental mental processes that shape everything from your daily habits to your deepest life choices. Let's break them down. Thinking is the function of logic, structure, and rational analysis. Thinkers are driven by clarity. When faced with a decision, they ask, what makes the most sense? They value truth, fairness, and mental precision. They may be seen as detached, but beneath that detachment is a desire for intellectual order in a chaotic world. Feeling, in Jungian terms, isn't just about being emotional. It's about making decisions based on values, emotional authenticity, and harmony. Feelers ask, what's the right thing to do for myself and others? They are deeply attuned to the emotional dynamics of relationships, often prioritizing connection over correctness. While some may label them too sensitive, they're guided by an internal compass rooted in meaning and human truth. Sensing is the function of direct experience. Sensors rely on what's concrete, real, and verifiable. They trust what they can see, touch, measure, and remember. Practical and grounded, they notice the fine details others miss. Their strength lies in the present moment, what is, not what could be. Intuition, by contrast, is the realm of abstraction. Intuitives focus on possibilities, patterns, and future implications. They look beyond surface facts to ask, what's the deeper meaning here? They often seem visionary, always connecting dots that no one else sees. But their mind can also wander, pulling them away from the present into the landscape of what might be. Now, here's the key. Every person uses all four of these functions, but in different orders and intensities. One of them is dominanted, leads your psyche. It's the lens through which you most naturally process the world. But unless you've taken the time to understand it consciously, you may have spent your whole life suppressing it in favor of what others expected from you. I once worked with a client named Josh. Since childhood, he was told to get serious, be practical, and follow the rules. So he became an engineer. He built a successful career, but inside, he felt like he was living someone else's life. There was no joy, no spark. When we explored his psychological type, it became clear Josh wasn't a sensor. As he had trained himself to be, he was a strong, intuitive. He needed imagination, strategy, vision. The moment he began reconnecting with his dominant function, his whole life changed. He didn't just feel more productive, he felt alive. That's the power of alignment. If life feels like an endless uphill climb, maybe it's not because you're failing. Maybe you're just living through someone else's wiring. When you ignore your natural function, everything feels harder than it needs to. Decisions drain you. Relationships feel confusing. You lose momentum, confidence, and purpose. But when you begin to live in tune with your dominant function, something powerful happens. You stop fighting yourself. You start flowing with your own current. You begin to understand why certain jobs exhaust you, why some relationships nourish you, and why your mind resists certain environments while thriving in others. So here's the question to sit with. Are you living in alignment with the way your mind was designed to operate here, the way the world trained you to behave? Because the moment you reclaim that alignment, you don't just feel more effective, you feel more you. And that's not just self-awareness. That's freedom. You start to notice it, don't you? Why certain conversations leave you drained while others light you up. Why some spaces feel like home and others feel like stages where you're performing a version of yourself. That shift in awareness, the moment you finally start recognizing how your mind naturally operates, is what Carl Jung devoted his life to uncovering. He once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And that's exactly what happens to most people. They don't realize that one of the strongest unconscious forces shaping their entire reality is their dominant psychological function. Jung believed that we're not limited by our type, but we are limited by our lack of awareness of it. Society doesn't teach us to understand how our mind is built. Instead, it rewards certain functions and subtly shames others. Logical thinkers are praised as rational and objective, while feelers are labeled too emotional. Sensors are seen as dependable and grounded, but intuitives are often dismissed as unrealistic or lost in their head. So we adapt, we suppress, we perform. We wear the roles that get rewarded, and in the process, we lose contact with our inner compass. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been good at something, but it never felt quite right? Like you could perform the task, fulfill the role, check all the boxes, but it still left you tired, hollow, or restless? That's the exhaustion of living outside your dominant function. You're not failing. You're operating with a system that doesn't fit your inner architecture. But once you reconnect with your natural function, the fog begins to clear. Decisions make more sense. Misunderstandings in relationships start to unravel. You begin to live with more ease because you're no longer swimming against the current of your own design. Now, maybe by this point you've already started to wonder, am I a thinker, a feeler, a sensor, an intuitive? That's a great start. But Jung's model goes deeper than just those four. Each of those functions expresses itself in two different directions, either extroverted focused on the external world or introverted focused on the internal world. That creates 8 distinct personality functions, each with a unique way of seeing, evaluating, and interacting with life. And understanding them isn't about putting yourself in a tighter box. It's about recognizing the hidden patterns that have shaped how you've always processed the world without even knowing it. Take the extroverted thinker, for example. They're like strategists or engineers of the outer world. Their mind seeks structure, order, productivity, and results. They excel at building systems that work. But in their drive for logic and efficiency, they may overlook emotional nuance or struggle to slow down and tune in to the people around them. Now contrast that with the introverted thinker. Instead of building outer systems, they're constructing inner frameworks, quietly analyzing, refining, and mentally solving puzzles that no one else sees. Their insights are often profound, but they struggle to articulate them. They're not just solving how to fix a problem, they want to understand why it exists in the first place. Or take the extroverted feeler, someone who intuitively reads a room and instinctively knows how to connect. They value harmony, care deeply about others, and often act as emotional glue in groups. But in constantly prioritizing others, they may lose touch with their own needs, pouring from a cup that's already empty. Meanwhile, the introverted feeler is led by an inner sense of truth. They make decisions based on deep alignment with their values, even if no one else understands them. These are the people who quietly carry entire worlds inside, but struggle to find words that do their inner experience justice. They're often misunderstood not because they lack depth, but because their depth is sacred. And this is just the beginning. There are also extroverted and introverted versions of sensing and intuition, each with their own strengths, blind spots, and needs. So, let me ask you this. Based on what you've heard so far, which lens feels most like yours? Do you lead with facts or possibilities? With values or logic? Do you gain energy from the outer world, or lose yourself in your inner one? And maybe more importantly, are you living from your true function, or from the version of yourself that was built for survival? Because Jung's work wasn't about typing people for the sake of identity. It was about freeing them from unconscious patterns. Your personality isn't a sentence, it's a system. And when you understand how it works, you stop reacting to life and start consciously shaping it. So if something in you is waking up right now, don't ignore it. This isn't just psychology. It's the beginning of self-possession and the doorway to becoming the person you were always meant to be. There's a reason some people thrive in chaos, while others need calm and quiet to feel like themselves. Carl Jung's personality theory doesn't just explain how we think, it explains why we react to the world so differently. And it's not just about whether you're a thinker or feeler. Beneath those broad categories are the specific functions of sensing and intuition, and how they express themselves may be the hidden key to why you feel in sync in some situations and completely misaligned in others. Let's start with the extroverted sensor. These are the doers, the real-time responders, the people who are fully immersed in the now. They experience life vividly. They trust what they can see, touch, taste, and measure. If there's a challenge in front of them, they'll tackle it head on. If there's an opportunity, they'll seize it without overanalyzing. These are your first responders, your action takers, your thrill seekers. But here's the flip side. Their constant drive for stimulation can sometimes keep them from slowing down, from reflecting, from seeing the bigger picture. They may be so grounded in the moment that they miss the meaning behind it. Then, there's the introverted sensor. Still grounded in reality, but in a different way. These individuals rely not on external stimulation, but on memory, stability, and inner experience. They're the archivists of the psyche, holding onto what worked, what felt true, what's proven. They don't move fast, but they move with purpose. They are deeply affected by past experiences and often use them as a guide for future choices. Their challenge? A tendency to cling to what's familiar, even when it no longer serves them. Change can feel like a threat, not an opportunity. Now contrast that with the dreamers of the personality system. The extroverted intuitives. These are the idea generators, the visionaries, the people who see 10 possibilities when everyone else sees one. They're creative, curious, and constantly drawn toward what could be. If something feels stagnant, they'll blow it up just to see what else is possible. But their gift comes with a cost. Because they're always chasing the next idea, they can struggle with follow-through. Their energy is in expansion, not execution. Opposite them are the introverted intuitives, perhaps the most mysterious of all. They don't speak often, but when they do, their insights can seem almost prophetic. These individuals see beneath the surface. They connect symbols, patterns, and timelines that others overlook. They often have a strong sense of what's coming, without always being able to explain why they know it. But this inner depth can create isolation. Because their knowledge is internal, private, and hard to articulate, they often feel like no one fully understands them. Jung believed that each of us leads with one of these 8 functions, and that this dominant function shapes the way we naturally move through the world. But here's the part most people overlook. You're not just your dominant function. You also have supporting functions, your auxiliary and tertiary end. Tucked away in the background, your inferior function. The one that feels like your blind spot. The one that surfaces under stress. The one you're often most resistant to exploring. But here's the truth. Your weakest function isn't a flaw. It's an invitation. I once worked with a client named Jason. To everyone around him, he was the picture of control. Organized, focused, productive. He led with extroverted thinking, and he used it well. But underneath the efficiency, he struggled to understand his emotions. He often misread the emotional needs of others, and in relationships, he felt like he was always missing something. When we explored his type, it became clear his inferior function was introverted feeling. He'd spent his life avoiding it because it felt soft, vague, and threatening to his identity. But when he slowly began to connect with that part of himself, not to abandon logic, but to balance it, everything shifted. His relationships improved. His decisions became more aligned. And most importantly, he began to feel whole. That's the deeper layer of Jung's work. The idea that the very part of you you've suppressed because it felt weak, unfamiliar, or inconvenientous, often the exact part you need in order to grow. So what about you? What part of your psyche have you been avoiding? Have you been so focused on your strengths that you've ignored the rest of you? Because here's what Jung believed. True self-development doesn't come from perfecting your dominant side. It comes from integrating your opposite. Your personality isn't a performance. It's a system of potential. And growth doesn't come from being more of what you already are. It comes from embracing what you've never dared to be. Carl Jung believed that the journey to becoming your true self, what he called individuationis, not about changing who you are. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you've pushed aside. And most of us have pushed something aside, not because we're weak, but because we've been taught to favor what feels familiar, comfortable, and socially acceptable. But here's the hard truth. The parts of you that feel awkward, uncomfortable, or undeveloped, That's where your growth lives. Imagine this. If you're someone who thrives on logic, who finds comfort in reason, analysis, and clarity, what happens when life throws you into a situation that can't be solved with logic? Grief, heartbreak, a loved one needing empathy instead of answers. Do you shut down, get defensive, retreat into silence? And on the other side, if you're emotionally driven by your heart, by values, by a need for connection, what happens when life demands cold decisions, firm boundaries, or detachment? Do you delay? Do you crumble under guilt? Do you try to be everything to everyone and lose yourself in the process? Jung argued that resisting your weaker functions is like trying to walk through life using only one arm. You might be able to manage for a while. You might even become really good at compensating. But when life demands balance, complexity, or adaptability, you'll feel that gap. The frustration, the anxiety, the inner friction that's not failure. That's your undeveloped function, asking to be seen. I once worked with a client named Sarah. She was a textbook, intuitive, brilliant, creative, always 10 steps ahead. Her ideas were bold, her vision was clear, but her execution? Constant chaos. Missed deadlines, forgotten appointments. She wasn't lazy. She had simply never developed her sensing function. The part of her that keeps track of details, builds structure, anchors, vision into reality. When she began to strengthen that neglected side knot, abandoning her intuition, but grounding it, everything changed. Her ideas became books. Her plans became products. Her vision turned into impact. And that's the heart of Jung's message. You don't need to become someone else. You need to become more whole. But that wholeness requires you to face something deeper, the part Jung called the shadow. It's made up of everything you've been taught to reject within yourself. Not just behaviors, but emotional truths. Maybe you were praised for being polite, so you buried your anger. Maybe you were told to stay strong, so you hid your sadness. Maybe you were encouraged to be selfless, so you silenced your needs. But here's the thing. Those parts didn't disappear. They just went underground. And the unconscious doesn't stay quiet. It leaks. It shows up in the moments you can't explain, emotional triggers, sudden outbursts, patterns that repeat no matter how hard you try to change. Ever found yourself saying, "I don't know why I reacted that way"? That's not irrationality. That's your shadow speaking. Jung didn't see the shadow as something evil. He saw it as a messenger. Its job is not to ruin your life. It's to wake you up, to show you what you've denied, what you've disowned, and what you still need to reclaim. Because integration isn't about losing control. It's about gaining awareness. When you stop running from the parts of yourself you fear and start listening to them instead, you gain something powerful: choice. You stop reacting automatically. You start responding consciously. That's what true self-awareness is. Not perfection, not performance, but wholeness. So ask yourself, what parts of you feel inconvenient, but are actually essential? What emotions do you judge in others because you've rejected them in yourself? This kind of inner work isn't flashy. It's not quick. It won't win you instant approval, but it will set you free. Because when you meet your shadow not as an enemy, but as a forgotten part of your soul, you begin to live with a different kind of power. Not the power to impress, but the power to be real. And that's where the true transformation begins. Understanding Jung's personality types isn't just some abstract theory reserved for academics or online quizzes. It's a practical lens through which you can transform how you live, love, and lead. Because the truth is, most of the conflict and confusion we experience in our relationships, our careers, and even within ourselves, doesn't come from bad intentions. It comes from psychological misalignment. We assume people see the world like we do. We expect them to respond the way we would. But Jung showed us that people don't just process different emotions, they process different realities. Take relationships, for example. Maybe you're a thinker-logical, structured, direct. And your partner? They're a feeler tuned into emotional dynamics, driven by values and meaning. When you bring up a problem, you're trying to solve it. but they might interpret that as cold or dismissive because they're not looking for a solution. They're looking to feel understood. And what happens next is a dynamic many of us know too well. One person feels unseen, the other feels unappreciated, and both walk away feeling misunderstood. But here's the breakthrough. Once you understand your own type and theirs, that friction becomes a dialogue instead of a dead end. The thinker learns that emotion isn't the opposite of logis, it's a different form of intelligence, and the feeler realizes that structure isn't a rejection of emotion, it's a way of offering support. Now let's talk about career. So many people feel stuck, unmotivated, or burned out, not because they're lazy, but because they're working in environments that don't match how their minds actually work. Take an extroverted sensor, someone who thrives in the present moment, who loves hands-on action and thinks fast on their feet. Put them behind a desk with repetitive tasks or endless theory, and they'll wither. But put them in a fast-paced, ever-changing role, event planning, emergency response, entrepreneurship, and they come alive. Now imagine an introverted intuitiva, quiet, visionary, someone who sees patterns, maps, meaning, and needs time to reflect before taking action. Put them in a loud, high-pressure sales floor, and they'll shut down. But give them a problem to analyze, a vision to shape, or a system to design, and they'll build something no one else could have imagined. Even how we solve problems is shaped by our type. Extroverted thinkers look for facts and systems. Introverted thinkers look for principles and internal logic. Extroverted intuitives brainstorm endless possibilities. Introverted intuitives hone in on one core insight that unlocks the whole picture. Sensors stay grounded in what's real and urgent. Feelers ask, what's the human cost? None of these are right or wrong. They're different lenses. And once you understand the lens you're looking through, you stop comparing yourself to people who see things differently. You stop thinking, what's wrong with me? And start realizing, this is just how I'm wired. So, let me ask you, where in your life have you been feeling frustrated, not because you've failed, but because the environment doesn't fit your mental design? Have you ever labeled someone as difficult, insensitive, or flaky without realizing they were just wired differently than you? Because this is the real gift of understanding Jung's system, compassion through clarity. When you understand your own blueprint, you become less reactive, more adaptable, and infinitely more patient with others and with yourself. You stop forcing yourself into a mold. You stop blaming people for not being like you. You start choosing environments that energize you. You start building relationships that honor your design. And perhaps most importantly, you stop living on autopilot and start living on purpose. Self-awareness is not just introspection. It's liberation. Because when you stop guessing who you are, you start owning it. And that's when everything starts to make sense. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Carl Jung's personality theory has shaped everything from therapy to corporate training to online quizzes, but somewhere along the way, its deeper meaning got lost. Today, most people think of personality types as fixed boxes. You're either a thinker or a feeler, a sensor or an intuitive, and once you're labeled, you're done. But that's not what Jung believed. Not even close. He never intended personality types to define you. He meant for them to guide you like a map, not a prison. Jung didn't see these functions as limits. He saw them as starting points, patterns of consciousness that could be developed, balanced, and evolved over time. In fact, he warned against identifying too strongly with a single type. Because when you over-identify with one part of your personality, you become blind to everything else you could be. Let's clear up a major myth. You are not just one type. You are not just a feeler or just a sensor. According to Jung, we all have access to all four functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. But we use them in different orders and with different levels of awareness. Your dominant function is simply the one you trust most, the one you've likely built your identity around. But your growth lies not just in strengthening it, but in bringing your weaker functions into the light. Unfortunately, Most modern tools like the MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, oversimplify this. They assign you a static 4-letter code and imply that's who you are forever. And while MBTI can be a helpful starting point, it often gives people a false sense of permanence. I'm an ent, so I can't do X, or I'm an NFEC, so I'm bad at Y. That's not psychological insight. That's a self-fulfilling limitation. Jung's original work was never about typing people to box them in. It was about helping them grow out of unconscious pattern sand toward greater wholeness. The same is true for introversion and extroversion. Most people assume introverts are shy and extroverts are loud. But Jung had a more profound definition. Introversion means your attention flows inward to thoughts, memories, reflections. Extroversion means your attention flows outward to people, activity, and the external world. You could be a socially outgoing introverter, a quiet, observant extrovert. It's not about how loud your voice is. It's about where your energy regenerates. I once had a friend named Alex who always called himself an introvert. He loved quiet, avoided crowds, and preferred working alone. But when we looked deeper, something didn't add up. He wasn't avoiding people. He was actually constantly attuned to their needs, reading the room, smoothing tensions, keeping peace. He was an extroverted feeler who had become overwhelmed by emotional energy and mistook it for social exhaustion. Once he understood that, everything changed. He didn't become someone new, just understood how to protect and recharge himself within the truth of how he was wired. And that's what this work is really about. Not changing your nature, but finally understanding it. So ask yourself, have you been defining yourself through simplified labels? Have you mistaken personality typing for identity, when in fact, it was meant to be a compass for growth? Because when you start to see Jung's framework as dynamic, not static as a living system within you, not a rigid identity, you stop asking, who am I? Like it's a fixed answer. And you start exploring it like it's a lifelong journey. Your dominant traits? They're just the first chapter. Your weaknesses? They're the doorway to your strength. Your personality? It's not a verdict. It's a landscape. And the more you explore it, the more whole you become. So next time you think, I'm just not that kind of person, pause. Maybe you're not. Or maybe you just haven't developed that part of you yet. Because Jung believed that within each of us is the capacity to become more than what we appear to be. And when you stop using your type to explain your limits and start using it to understand your potential, that's when everything begins to shift. So as we wrap up, remember this. Your personality isn't a label, it's a living system. A complex architecture of thoughts, preferences, instincts, and unconscious patterns. Jung didn't give us types to define us. He gave us a framework to liberate us, to help us stop living on autopilot and start living with intention. Throughout this video, we've explored how your dominant function shapes your perspective, how your weaker functions hold the key to growth, and how the process of individuation isn't about becoming someone else, it's about becoming whole. Integrating the parts of you you've forgotten, rejected, or been taught to hide. This is the real inner work. Not fixing what's broken, but uncovering what's been buried. Because when you finally understand how your mind is designed to operate, you stop living a life of constant friction and start living a life of alignment. So if something in this resonated with you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel seen, that's not a coincidence. It means the process has already begun. And now the question is yours. Which part of your personality are you most curious to develop next? Is it the function you've always trusted or the one you've silently avoided? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear how this framework lands for you. And if this journey helped bring more clarity to your inner world, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because here, on Channel Psychology Insights, we explore the deep questions that help you live more consciously, more powerfully, and more fully you. This isn't just theory. It's a path. And it begins the moment you stop asking who you should be and start becoming who you already are underneath it all.